just one last feature for this application. We need to make a button that the user can press to buy the album off of Amazon. So remember, we're not going to actually handle payments. We just want to open up the user's browser on their mobile device and point them over to the store page for this album so they could buy it. So there's two distinct challenges here. First, we need to be able to receive some amount of feedback from the user, like handling the actual button press here. And we also need to figure out how to open the user's web browser on their device and point them at a very specific URL. We'll first make use of the button, we'll first make the button, and then we'll focus on how to open the user's browser. Okay, so that's the plan here. Now, I mentioned a while ago that one of the big challenges of React Native is dealing with styling components. Specifically the fact that there isn't really a nice default set of nice looking components that you can just use right out the gate. So to deal with this, we'll first be making a reusable button component and then focus on customizing it for our needs. Okay, so we're going to make a reusable button that we can use on future projects as well, and then we're going to customize it for our needs. So you know what the next step is. We need to make a new file to house our button. So it's going to be button.js inside of our components directory. And inside of here, we're going to place our boilerplate. What else did you think we were going to do? All right, so we'll import React from React at the top. We'll import our text tag because, of course, our button is going to need some text from React Native. Next, we'll declare our button component. And inside of here, I'll place just some JSX that says, inside of a text tag, click me. Finally, at the bottom, we will export default button, like so. Now, I want to be able to see this button immediately. I want to get it to show up in the simulator so we can actually make use of it and develop it on the fly. So I'm going to immediately import it into our album detail. So inside of album detail, I'm inside of album detail right now. I'm going to import it as button from button. And I'm going to create a new card section after both the existing two that we have to house the button. Remember, that was the goal all along. We were going to have 3 card sections, and the last one was going to house that button. So I'll add on another card section here. And it's going to contain our button component, like so. One quick aside, I see kind of varying community convention on this, on whether or not you want to put a new line character between major sections in your JSX. So for us, we have 3 distinct card sections. So maybe we want to put in a new line here just to say, hey, this is kind of a distinct separate part of our render method. It's totally up to you. I kind of waffle back and forth making use of it. But to be honest with you, I also tried not to have components that look this large. So really you can go either way. Totally up to you. Okay, let's flip back over to our button. Here it is. And I'm also going to open up my simulator, and I'm just going to refresh it just to make sure everything's hooked up correctly. So I'll refresh, and all right, there we go. Text of click me down there. And of course, clicking on it does absolutely nothing just yet. We haven't done anything at all to handle tapping on the thing. One also quick note here is that clicking in the simulator is equivalent to tapping with your finger. So whenever I say tap on the device or something like that, for the simulator, we can just click on it, totally equivalent. Okay, so let's continue with some of the basics of the button, like how we deal with the user tapping on it and whatnot. For this is kind of a pretty big topic, how we handle user feedback. So I'm going to open up the React Native documentation, and we're going to just look at the docs a little bit on this subject. So in my browser, I've already got the React Native documentation open. If you want to follow along in your own browser, you can just do a Google search for the React Native docs. Otherwise, I'm going to point us directly at what we need to be looking at. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and on the left-hand side, I'm going to go until I find this section here of touchable highlight, touchable native feedback, touchable opacity, and touchable without feedback. Okay, so these 4 things here. The only 2 that we really care about right now are touchable highlight, there it is, and touchable opacity as well. So I want to tell you right now, do not let these names throw you off. They are fancy names for button. Literally, they are fancy names for a button. A touchable highlight is a button. A touchable opacity is a button. That's all they are, okay? These are all basic components for dealing with user presses, and the biggest difference between them is just how they deal with providing feedback to the user. So for example, when a user taps on a touchable highlight, the button has the option to very briefly turn a different color, which kind of like highlights the button as being pressed. It is literally just about providing feedback to the user. So on the other hand, like a touchable opacity, remember opacity means kind of like fade or see through. So when a user taps on a touchable opacity, the button is going to briefly fade away, just to let the user know, hey, we registered that click, like we know you just did something. Don't worry, we're going to handle that click event or that press event you just triggered. So for our app, we are going to be using the touchable opacity, but again, we could use any of these things and we would do just fine because they are all just buttons. That's all they are. So with the touchable opacity, again, it means that whenever a user taps on this thing, the opacity of the wrapped view is decreased, kind of dimming it. That's all it is. Whew. All right, so we are going to add in the touchable opacity, and then we're just going to add it to our render method, add it to our component, and just see what it looks like, what happens when we tap on it. So inside of my button, I'm going to import my touchable opacity, and then I'm going to treat it as though it were a view tag. So I use these touchable things to wrap other components. Okay, that's the entire idea behind it. We use them to wrap the things that we want to be able to like tap on. So in our case, I want to be able to tap on this click that says click me, because it says, click me. Of course, I want to tap on the thing. So I'm going to wrap this text tag with a touchable opacity. All right, so I'm going to now refresh the simulator, and let's see how this thing behaves. So I'm going to go down to click me, and I'll tap on it, and lo and behold, it fades. Hooray! Remember, the entire goal of this right here is just to provide the user with some amount of feedback to say, hey, don't worry, the app is not like locked up, we're not frozen here, something is happening. That's the entire point of these touchable objects. Okay, there's one other thing to be aware of though. They also give us the ability to listen for an actual press. And so when a user presses on this thing, we have the option to execute some code. So let's continue in the next section and figure out how to wire up that kind of tap handler, or that thing that's going to execute when a user presses on this thing. So let's take a quick break, see you in the next section. In the last section, we created a new reusable button component and hooked it up with the touchable opacity tag. The touchable tag of all types are used for just two purposes. Remember, providing some feedback to the user that their tap was registered, and also giving us the ability to respond to these taps, like to run a callback or run some code where we can do something whenever the user taps on the button. So at this point, we haven't done anything around handling user input. So in this section, we're going to hook up a click event handler that's going to watch and listen for whenever a user taps on our touchable opacity right here. I hope that you're prepared for some typing though. Really quick, we're going to add on some styling to our button. It's pretty darn ugly right now, and in fact, it looks absolutely nothing like a button. So we're going to take a little bit of time to add on some styling for our button, and then we'll take care of that event handler. So you know what we do whenever we do styling. We add a new object beneath our component, call it const styles, and I'm going to give it a property of button style. So let's get started. First off, we're going to add a rule of flex 1. Remember, flex 1 means I want this button to expand to fill as much content as it possibly can. Next, I'll apply an align self style of stretch. Align self is a property tied to Flexbox. So if you remember, we have align items. Align items is when a container tells all of its children that it needs to position all those items in some fashion. The align self rule, however, is when we want this element to position itself using Flexbox rules. So align self stretch is going to specifically say stretch to fill the limits of the container. Next, we'll assign a background color. And then we're going to do some borders. So we'll do a border radius of 5. This will give it nice, very rounded borders. We'll do a border width of 1 and a border color of, and you're gonna have to write this one down, 007 AFF. This blue color right here maps up pretty nicely with the iOS blue, so our button is gonna look kind of like an iOS button. Next, we'll have a margin left of 5 and a margin right of 5. And again, this is just to make sure that our button doesn't actually kind of butt up against any other borders or line work or text or anything like that. So let's destructure that button style property into our component and then apply it to the touchable opacity tag. So inside of our component, we'll destructure button style from styles, and we're going to apply it to our touchable opacity. Cool. Next, I want to do just one more quick property. I want to add on some better styling for our text right here. You know, as it stands right now, the text is just black and white. Might as well just be Times New Roman, right? For what we saw in the simulator. So it'd be really nice if the text also looked a little bit more button-like. So we'll add in a couple of properties for the text as well. In our styles object, I'm going to add a text style. I'm going to give it, again, an align self. That's going to center the text inside the button. We'll give it the same color of 007 AFF, a font size of 16, and then we're going to give it a font weight. Font weight is for specifying the boldness, or I suppose thinness, of a text element. So we will specify a font weight of 600. They'll be pretty deep on the edge of font when it comes to boldness. So it's definitely going to appear to be some pretty bold text. Next, we want to make sure that the text is not really squished by the border on the touchable opacity. You know, we want to have some space above and below the actual text element to make this thing really look like a button. So we'll give it a padding top of 10 and a padding bottom of 10 as well. And then just like we did with the button style, we will also destructure the text style out. And then we'll apply that to our text tag. So style of text style. And then as a final bit of just stylistic concern here for my code, I'm going to new line the text tag just to make it a little bit more legible. All right, so let's refresh this in the simulator now and see if we can't do something better than this click me text. So we'll refresh, and all right, hot dog. That is looking pretty darn good. That's definitely looking good. And you'll notice that when we click it, oh, I still got a little bit of lag in my simulator. There we go. When we click it, the button fades nicely. That means that whenever our user presses on this button when they're using the application, they will know, oh, okay, something like, you know, something is happening here. My press was registered. I expect my app to do something now. Okay, this looks fantastic. I'm really happy with it, but we still need to make sure that we handle a press event on the touchable opacity. So let's take care of that inside the next section. In the last section, we added some styling to our button tag, but still nothing happens whenever we press it besides that visual effect. All the touchable components out there, so touchable opacity, touchable highlight, and the other two that we looked at, are some of the few components in React Native that allow us to directly catch feedback from the user. So the idea here is simple. Whenever the user presses on something, they expect something to occur, right? So we need to add a hook or a catch, something into our component that says whenever a user presses this thing right here, run some code. You know, open up the user's web browser, or maybe fetch a list of posts, or delete a post, or tweet something, you know, whatever it might be. So of course, React Native has us covered on this topic. We can optionally add a prop to the touchable opacity called onPress. So let's do that now. We pass a function to onPress, and then whenever the touchable opacity is pressed by the user, that function will be called. So let's just throw in some dummy function for right now. I'll throw in a console log of pressed, like so. So I passed a fat arrow function. So my expectation is that whenever a user presses on the touchable opacity, I should see a console log of pressed. So let's give this a shot out in the simulator. I'll first bring up my Chrome debugger, and then I'll refresh my simulator. So then I'll do my click here. And you'll notice that my console over here is lagging behind just a little bit, but eventually, yep, I get up, pressed, pressed, so on and so on. Okay, so definitely the console log appears. So the trick here, the real challenge, is just remembering a bit of trivia about how we handle user input. If we want to handle a tap event from the user, we can add a touchable highlight or a opacity tag, whichever one we might want, and create an onPress handler. The onPress handler will then be called whenever the user taps on the element. Okay, so that's like step one here. Now we know when a user is tapping on this thing. But we still have two more challenges. Remember, our ultimate goal is to direct the user to a website where they can actually buy this album. Second, right now we are creating this onClick handler inside of this component, this like button component, right? But we want this button to be reusable. So in other words, we don't want this button to know that, hey, whenever you are pressed, you should open like some website, because that would completely defeat the purpose of making a reusable component. If we put a function right here that said whenever you're pressed, open up a website, it would be a very particular use case for a button. So instead, we need to have some way to make sure we've got very generic, very general logic inside of this button component right here, where we can reuse it with other components, completely different use cases in the future. So let's tackle that challenge first. Here's how we're going to take care of it. First, we're going to kind of walk through the code, and then we're going to talk about, or excuse me, we're going to write out the code, and then we'll talk about exactly what's going on. So first, I'm going to flip over to album detail. So here's album detail. I'm inside the render function, and I'm going to find our button tag towards the bottom. So here's my card section inside of album detail. Here's my button tag. I'm going to I'm going to provide a prop of onPress to this button. And inside of it, I'm going to console log the album's title. So remember, the album detail has a title property floating around, so I'm just going to console log that title. So now I am passing a prop called onPress to the button. One thing I want to make really clear here, this onPress is not going to be just like naturally, just magically consumed by the button. Okay, we have to make sure that we actually wire up this onPress prop inside the button. I could have just as easily called this thing when pressed or something. I could have called it anything I wanted. I'm just choosing to call the prop onPress. But the point I'm really trying to convey here is calling this function onPress is not the same as passing the touchable opacity in onPress prop. In the case of the touchable opacity, it is expecting a prop of onPress. But right now, as our button is put together, there's no concept of an onPress prop for the button. So we need to make sure that our button actually makes use of that onPress callback that we just added in here. So I'm going to go back to button, and I'm going to say, hey, touchable opacity, whenever you get pressed, whenever someone presses you, I want you to run a function that is provided by the parent component. And so that parent component, the thing that we want to run in here, is coming from the props object. It's going to be props.onPress. So let's do a little bit of destructuring to get access to that callback. So here's onPress. And just to be really clear, this onPress reference right here is exactly equal to this fat arrow function inside of the album detail. So same exact function being passed down as a prop. Now inside the button, we'll say, hey, whenever you get pressed, I want you to run that function that was declared in the parent. That's it. That's all you have to do. So now our button should be a little bit more usable, but let's test this out in the simulator first, just to make sure it's working. So now our expectation is that whenever we press on that button, we should see the album's title be console logged. So I'm going to wait just a minute for my console to kind of warm up. There we go. All right, so there's Taylor Swift. I can go down to the next album, Fearless, Speak Now, and so on. Let's just, what the heck? Okay, 1989, there we go. You get the idea, you get the idea. Okay, so just to review one last time, this is how we make reusable components with React, or I should say this is another technique that we use for making reusable components with React Native. I realized that my button component right here needs to do something differently every single time the user presses on it across, however many times I make a button component inside my application. So rather than telling the button, hey, whenever you're pressed, please open some website, in hard coding that inside of the button component, I instead decided to add in a prop of onPress, and then I told the button, hey, whenever you get called, call that parent prop that was passed, call that callback. And whatever specific behavior was in there, go ahead and let that thing run. Okay, so this is good call right here. Let's continue the next section, and we're going to figure out how to open a website whenever a user presses on that button. In the last section, we spent some time to make sure that we had a very reusable button component. So now we can place the button component, pass in a prop of onPress, and then whenever the user presses on it, boom, something different is going to happen, which is exactly what we want. So the next thing we need to do is figure out, okay, well, when a user does press this thing, how do we direct them over to their web browser and point them to a very specific URL? So if we were in the browser environment, if we were doing React.js here, we could put in an anchor tag or something like that and just say, okay, anchor tag, whenever someone clicks you, take the user here. There you go. Well, unfortunately with React Native, it's not quite as straightforward as that. There's no concept really of an anchor tag, any way of telling our app to just say like, oh yeah, just automatically pop open a browser. It's a little bit more complicated. Well, it's not that, let me tell you, it's not that much more complicated, but it's not an anchor tag. So whatever, let's just get to it. Inside my browser, I'm gonna pop open the React Native documentation. So here we are. And on the left-hand side, I'll scroll down until I find the section that contains APIs. So here's APIs right here. And I'm looking for a very particular API called linking. So here's linking. So the linking library, which is provided by React Native, is how we kind of interface our application with other apps that are running on a user's mobile device. Included in there, the user's browser. So whenever we want to kick a user over to their browser, we can make use of this linking library. And again, you can also read the documentation in here in case you're curious, and you can figure out how to kick the user over to other apps as well. So you might want to kick the user over to Uber so that they can request a ride, or their email client so they can write an email, or whatever other app the user might have on their device. This is how you interface with it, with the linking library. So for our use case, just sending the user over to a browser, it's not going to be too bad. Let's check out one method in the docs for this thing. I'm going to scroll back down, and you can find on here, linking library has a method called openURL. And basically, if we want to add or open up a website, web address, we can just call openURL with a plain text, normal vanilla URL, like an HTTP type URL. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. Remember that in our albums object, we've already got the URL to the Amazon store available as the URL property. So basically, we need to call linking.openURL with this URL, and we should be good to go. So let's give this a shot. Back in my album detail, I'm going to go back up to the top, and I will import the library linking from React Native. And then where I am destructuring off my album object, I will also pull off the URL property as well. So here's our URL. Now inside of our button, we will replace the console log statement with linking.openURL, and notice that it's capital U, capital R, and L. And then we'll just say, yeah, just open that web page right there. Okay, let's give this a shot in our simulator. And I will click the button. Oops. And you'll notice that I got kicked over to Amazon.com, and my simulator is a little bit laggy right now, but here we go, this music album. And automatically on the top left-hand side, I can click back to albums and go back to my application. And I could then go down to the next album, click that one, and there we go. Perfect. So this is exactly what we wanted. This is looking really fantastic. I think there's just one last thing we need to do. we need to make sure that our button at the bottom of each card has a little bit better text than just click me. So let's take care of that in the next section. So our app looks pretty great at this point in time. I think there's just one last thing we need to do. We need to make sure that the button's text gets changed to something more reasonable than click me. So we could just change the text to something like buy now inside of our button component. Right now here is the hard-coded click me. But if we just change it to buy now, we're still kind of defeating the purpose of making a reusable button component. So I feel like this would be a great opportunity to pass in the text to show inside this button as a prop to the button. Now there's two ways we could do this. We can either add in a prop, just like the onPress one, of maybe something like, text, and it should say like buy now. That would be one approach. The second approach that I think might be a little bit, more fun with a button component, something like this, is to use that same props.children trick that we saw earlier. So let's do that instead. If you recall, if we expand out the button tag and then pass some text directly in here, we can then get a reference to this text as props.children inside of the button component. So now we can go back over to our button and replace click me with a reference to props.children. So notice that I don't have a props object or argument here. I'm destructuring out of the arguments list, so I will just destructure out children as well. And then in place of click me, I'll place children. Cool, so let's give this a test. And now we've got a much more reasonable buy now on our buttons. Perfect. So again, this is just a step to make sure that we've got a truly reusable component. Our button tag right now is 100% reusable all over the place. It is not tied to the implementation of the card section. And in fact, there is absolutely no reference in here whatsoever to any type of album or URL or artist name or anything like that. So we can definitely make reuse of this in future applications as well. Okay, so I think that's just about it for our first application. I gotta tell you, I'm really happy with how this thing looks. I think it looks really professional. So let's take a little minute in the next section to do a wrap up on all the topics that we spoke about. I know this app took quite a while to build, but like I mentioned several times, React Native introduces many new topics. So for the first time through, we took everything slow, and from here we'll pick up the pace, except of course when we cover a new topic. Before we finish this app, I want to discuss some of the major things we learned as we worked our way through it. First, we generated the project using the React Native CLI. This produced a new React Native project capable of running in either the Android or iOS simulators. Next, after we generated the project, we started up the simulator using either React Native Run iOS or React Native Run Android at the command line. Remember, that's how you start your application up in the simulator. Next, once we had our app running, we created quite a few different components. We found out that there were two different types of components inside of React Native. We've got our class-based components, which are components that have access to component level state and lifecycle methods. And then we also have access to functional components, which are largely presentational components that just produce some amount of JSX and show some data back to the user. Speaking of state, we use state inside of the album list component. State is a feature of React available only to class-based components. State is used to record and react to user interactions. So in our case, we fetched a list of albums, and then we assigned or updated our state using the setState call. Remember that we only ever update our state object with this.setState. We never do something like this.state equals blah, blah, blah. Because we call setState, our component instantly re-rendered and showed the list of albums that it had retrieved after we made our HTTP request. Next, we created an album detail component by mapping over our list of items. Here it is. So we mapped over our list of items, and for each album we had retrieved, we produced one album detail component. Passing this data, we passed the album to the album detail component by specifying a prop. So prop is any type of data that we pass from a parent to a child component. That is the prop system. Finally, we made extensive use of reusable components inside this application. So we've got our button tag here, we've got our card section, and finally our header. All four of these completely reusable components. And they're so reusable, in fact, that we are going to make use of them on our next project. So we are going to copy paste these directly over to our next project. So please don't, mess around with them too much. So this is definitely a nice looking app to start off with. We learned a lot, but there's still a tremendous amount to learn about React Native. So let's continue in the next section and start up our next app.